Daniel, I'm very excited to talk to you because you are a very interesting person. And to say your backstory is fascinating is an understatement. I feel like getting to know you, we have to first get to know your father because he was such an important influence on you. And his story, I think, very much shaped the person you are today. Tell us about your dad, Roman.
Absolutely. I do think that my story starts with my family, and particularly with my dad, who was probably one of the greatest influences in my life. He was a little kid when World War II started. He was 9 years old when World War II started, and around 10 years old when it started impacting him very personally and in very, very horrible ways. Eventually, he landed in a concentration camp in Dachau, and he was liberated by American soldiers. And I can speak for hours about him, but I'll say that what was remarkable about my dad, Katie, is that he was able to speak about the horrors of what he went through without it making him embittered about the world or about humanity. He was the kindest, sweetest person you would meet. And every person he met, it was like it was his mission to make their day better. He was always building bridges. He was always like my mom, also was a bridge builder. My dad was always trying to connect with people, and he didn't shy away from speaking about what happened with him, but he found a way to remember those small moments of heroism by kind people that saved his life as much as the horrible moments that were probably the dominant part of his experience. But he found a way to remember uh, the humanity that helped him survive.
How long was he in Dachau?
He was in Dachau. He was in a series of concentration camps for about 3 years. I think Dachau was about a year and a half or two. Prior to that, he was in Schanzerlager. And what's interesting, if you look at the documents that were in the Germans' possessions that are now in several museums, it says that he was born in 1927, but in fact, he was born in 1930. And the reason is that his father lied so that my dad would have a greater chance of living, because he had been told that if the kids were too young, they would just kill them. And in Dachau, there was also a labor camp where they would make you work. Many people died from the way they were working, but he at least was able to survive. And, I can tell you many stories about the conditions, but by his dad being by his side and protecting him and lying, my dad was able to serve in the work camp for till the American soldiers rescued them.
Did he lose relatives?
Yeah. The nuclear family, my grandmother, my uncle, my dad, and my grandfather all were rescued, though they were separated and they were not reunited, because then my grandmother ended up behind the Soviet Union for another 12 years after surviving the war. Uh, but obviously, they had a lot of uncles, cousins, his grandparents perished, and many other people died.
It's unbelievable when you think about how relatively recently the Holocaust was, isn't it?
Well, for me, Katie, what's most stunning is that not only was it only like 70 some years ago, but all throughout my upbringing, my first, I don't know, 45, 50 years of my life, I couldn't connect the dots of how stuff like that can happen. How could anything like that ever happen? And it's very depressing for me that I now can understand it. That only in the last several years have I noticed how power works, how humanity can be so manipulated and dehumanized, and how polarization can lead to such divisions, and the rise of authoritarianism and dictatorial forces. I'm by no means saying that anywhere in the world today is as bad as what happened in World War II, but you can connect dots to understand how we could land there. I mean, 10 years ago, none of us thought that this was remotely an issue. And many of us now can appreciate that we cannot take for granted the freedom and democracy that made America what it is today, and the freedom and democracy they brought to the entire world, which now literally across the world, you see this rise of neo-fascist extremism across the spectrum of politics. You have dictatorial figures from the left as well as from the right across all 5 continents.
We'll talk about that and your work. We'll talk about that and the work you're doing on polarization in just a bit. But I wanted to continue with your family story because your father at 17 immigrated to Mexico. He only had a 3rd grade education. He didn't speak English or Spanish. And he went to Mexico and became very successful. Why Mexico? And to what do you attribute his success?
He landed in Mexico because he had nowhere else to go. An aunt and uncle of his had landed in Mexico before the war, again, because they had nowhere else to go. And Mexico, I guess, let them in. And when he arrived, like you said, the way he educated himself was by getting used encyclopedias and reading them cover to cover. And the way he read those encyclopedias was by going to the movies and watching. And so he taught himself Spanish and English. When he passed away, he spoke 9 languages fluently. And he had read thousands upon thousands of books and literally entire encyclopedias cover to cover. That's how he got his education. And he worked double and triple shifts till he was able to start his small business with his father, and then eventually became a very successful businessman. And we eventually came to the United States when I turned 15 and a half. But what's interesting is when I arrived as 15 and a half, I had all the opportunities. I had a roof under my, body, or whatever the expression is.
Roof over your head.
Roof over my head. I always mangle those expressions, Katie. I had a roof over my head and had, all the opportunities that my dad never had. When he was 15 and a half, he was liberated by American soldiers. And by the way, when you think about the American soldiers that liberated him, you imagine the prototypical image of an American soldier, but it was Japanese Americans. And is the most decorated battalion and regiment in the United States was the 522nd and 446th. I get confused between the battalion and the regiment. And it was Japanese Americans whose families were, incarcerated or interned while they were fighting to liberate another continent. The most highly decorated soldiers were Black Americans and Japanese Americans. And when my dad first saw them, he didn't understand what to make of it because he had never seen a Japanese person. And all of the Holocaust survivors were, at the beginning, they saw the tanks advancing, because I didn't tell you the story what happened, but as the American forces were advancing, the Nazis came up with a final plan, with their final solution to get rid of the Jews. They didn't have enough bullets to kill all the inmates, so they were going to walk them up mountains, ravines, and throw them off a cliff. And they were walking my father and my grandfather and thousands of other inmates without, coats, and some of them died along the way because they were already, my dad was 6 foot tall and he weighed less than 70 pounds. So they were all almost subhuman by then. And they didn't have proper shoes. They didn't have coats. And they went, and all of a sudden a snowstorm hit. So the German soldiers kept advancing, and all the inmates thought, this is how we're going to die in this snowstorm in the middle of these mountains. But what happened is that the snow formed kind of like an igloo over the people, and my father and my grandfather passed away. And when they woke up, I don't know, 12 hours later, they had the heat of their bodies had kept a little bit of a igloo thing. And when they snuck out of the snow and carved, dug out of the snow, these subhuman forms were coming out of the white snow and finding that the Germans had continued marching ahead because they didn't want to get caught by the Americans. They were very hungry, so the inmates started heading back to look for food into a town when the tanks came. And when they saw the tanks, they're like, oh no, here are the Nazis again. But it wasn't, it was the American soldiers in the form of Japanese Americans. And so you can imagine these Jewish inmates not understanding this, and the Japanese Americans being the sweetest and kindest people, feeding them chocolates and taking care of them. And can you imagine witnessing, seeing these people that look like they're not human beings, like almost carcasses walking, and seeing that suffering and that what had become them? And then the captain, Su Ito, who was a 26-year-old captain at the time, befriended my uncle, Larry, who helped them then. Even though my dad and my grandfather went to Mexico, my uncle joined them as a translator and then helped for several months or a year as their translator, trying to help locally. 70 years later, Katie, I get a phone call from a friend of mine and said, do you know Larry Lubetzky? And I'm like, yeah, of course, that's my uncle. He recently passed away. They're like, well, we're here with Dr. Suito, who by then became one of the greatest eminences at Harvard. He became an incredible scientist. He invented several things. And he was talking as a head of the American Japanese, it was called the Japanese American Council. He was talking to the heads of the American Jewish community. And I was reunited with Dr. Suito. I got to connect with him. And then I got to connect with his family. Dr. Suito died shortly after that, but I got to give an eulogy in front of his family. And I brought my son, whose name is Roman, who's named for my father, for him to thank his children and grandchildren for how their grandfather had liberated my dad.
That's an amazing story. And just the degree of human suffering, and then the degree of compassion is just hard to even comprehend, I think. And gosh, anyway, thank you for sharing that story, Daniel. You were saying earlier, at 15 and a half, you and your family, at 15 and a half, you and your parents immigrated to the US. You moved to Texas. And I understand that was because anti-Semitism was increasing in Mexico. That's one of the reasons you all moved?
The predominant reason why we moved is because my father had built a successful business in the border between Mexico and the United States, selling duty-free goods, and he was in the jewelry business, and so he was a specialist in watches. But there was a secondary reason, which, maybe we were told that was primarily for the opportunity, but by connecting the dots, I do think that my father noticed how in 1984 there started being a wave of anti-Semitism, and he said, I'm not taking risks again. So it was to some degree also being better safe than sorry.
At 15 and a half, was it hard for you to find yourself in the United States, in Texas? Probably not as difficult as your father finding himself in Mexico. But what was that transition like for you, Daniel?
I mean, it was a lot of fun, honestly. I mean, I had a girlfriend, my first girlfriend, that I left, and I was very sad. And, I'm Latin at the end of the day, so I was very heartbroken. But it was a great experience because for us, the United States was not just the land of opportunity, but the land of Disneyland and long cereal aisles. So, in Mexico, there were 2 cereals, and here you show up and there's dozens of cereals, and you can choose a different cereal every day. And so it was for us, it was very special. It was, difficult adjusting, but I was very blessed. The one thing I'll tell you, Katie, is arriving from a very homogeneous environment, because in Mexico, I went to a Jewish school, which was a school of immigrants. So even though there's a very few Jewish people in Mexico, they were very tightly knit. And it's so tightly knit that I didn't know that sometimes I was using words in Yiddish rather than Spanish. So my mom, who was born and raised in Tampico, Tamaulipas, her parents immigrated a generation before, also from Eastern Europe, but she was raised with only Catholic friends. For her, it was very important that I also meet other Christian kids. So she made me befriend a son of her friends. And when we were playing it, I said, all right, I'll be right back. I'm going to go pishing. And he says, what? He's like, yeah, I'm going to go pishing. I'm going to go to the bathroom. He's like, I don't know what pishing means. In Spanish, it's a voy a pichar, which is the stupidest thing in the world, because that's not Spanish. It's how we Jewish Mexican kids used to speak. But I used to say voy a pichar, thinking that I'm going to the bathroom. He said, what is this pichar? I don't understand it. And I said, stop joking around or I'm going to kick you in the tujes. Te voy a dar una pateada en el tujes. He said, what is this tujes? And I thought tujes was Spanish. I saw you having lived in New York, knew better than tujes is a Yiddish word for tushy. But I literally was like 14 years old when I found out that I was speaking Yiddish, thinking it was Spanish. So then I go from that environment into San Antonio, Texas, to Robert E. Lee High School, where if I was late more than 3 times, they would hit me with licks back then. And you think that I'm 90 years old, but this was 1984. And there were a lot of cliques. So when I arrived in San Antonio, the first image that I saw when I was coming in, being dropped off, was these guys with 10-gallon hats holding a guy by the arms and by the legs and ramming him into a post. And I learned that that was the initiation to become a kicker. So that's the only thing I knew, is that I didn't want to be a kicker. But other than that, I didn't have the pattern recognition to understand that they were, break dancers and new age kids and jocks and debate kids and drama kids. So I was friendly with every one of those kids. And one day I would sit down with the black kids, and the other one with the Hispanic kids, the other one with the white kids. And I didn't understand that they were all different. And one day, Amber Alonso, who was this very beautiful punk rocker, approached me, and she's like, Daniel, I just need to give you some advice. You kind of need to define yourself, because also I didn't know how to dress. So one day I was dressed with a Michael Jackson, outfit, and the other day with a, sporty pants. And I was breaking this social order. And she said, Daniel, you have to choose one of these groups. You cannot be friends with all of these guys and sit with all of them. But I chose never to choose, and to always be friends with everybody. So I was the odd kid that got along with everybody. And that ended up becoming kind of a pattern for the future.
You ended up going to college. I forget where you went to undergraduate. I know that you went to Stanford Law, but where did you go as an undergraduate?
I went to Trinity University. I was the first person from my family to go to college, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I hand wrote my applications. My friends at Robert E. Lee said, Daniel, you're a double minority, Mexican and Jew. You're going to get anywhere. Just apply anywhere you want. Like, we didn't know what we were doing. I was first generation, so I didn't understand the concept of college, let alone college applications. So I hand wrote my applications on a plane and handed them over to the flight attendant and asked her if she could please deposit them. And she did, because I got the rejections very soon thereafter. And so the deadlines had passed, and I was actually a junior, but the Mexican system actually in my private school was more advanced. So I'd taken all of my AP classes in high school. So I wanted to graduate, but the council didn't want to let me graduate. She said, okay, if you get to college, you can graduate. Otherwise, you're going to stay and take home economics and whatever. And so once I passed the deadlines, I was in trouble. And fortunately, my cousin introduced me to a friend who eventually introduced me to Trinity University, and they waived the deadline that they allowed me to apply. And I typed my applications and I got into Trinity. It was an incredible experience. It's there that I first fell in love with learning, and I became very curious. Up until then, I was a smart kid, but I was just breezing by. I didn't really read or apply myself. And in college on my own, I started getting very curious and I read a ton. I had to get glasses because I was reading so much. And I wrote a 268-page thesis. And that's when I became an official nerd.
Well, you must have done pretty well because you got into Stanford Law School and you originally wanted to be a career diplomat, but you changed your mind at Stanford or shortly thereafter. Why?
I went to Stanford Law because I thought I was going to be a diplomat to try to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. I was very passionate since I was a kid about building bridges, particularly to bring peace to Israel and all of its neighbors.
You got obsessed with that when you were about 12 years old, right?
Ever since I was 12, I had been studying and trying to build those bridges. And in college, I had written about how to use economics to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. And in law school, I started learning about how economic forces have such an overarching impact in our lives, and how the private sector might be a better conduit and market forces for bringing people together. So I had the idea for using business and commerce to encourage neighbors to become friends and to work together.
Which is so interesting and really the impetus for this organization called Peaceworks, which was the food company with the goal of using business to bring neighbors together. This was years before the notion of a social entrepreneur even existed. So tell us how you got this idea. Obviously, you felt at Stanford Law, government and bureaucracy was too sort of, I don't know, paralyzed to really move the ball forward, and that you could do more in the private sector. But how did this notion of food and producing food as a means to create peace, where did that come from?
Yeah, so the college thesis at Trinity is where I discovered I studied abroad for 6 months in Israel and met Palestinian friends and Israeli friends. And I started becoming very curious about the power of economics to advance conflict resolution. That's when I wrote my thesis on it. After law school, where I wrote, so it was extraordinarily theoretical in college. Then in law school, I wrote a legislative proposal for how Americans could be catalysts for bringing neighbors together in the Middle East. And I got a fellowship for $10,000 from the Haas Koshland Award. And that kind of gave me the courage to not become a lawyer and to try out this idea. And when I was writing my research in the Middle East and I was living in Israel, in one of my late nights of doing my research, I went to a supermarket and I bought this obscure looking jar of sun-dried tomato spread. And back in 1993, I had never heard what a sun-dried tomato was. It was delicious. I downed the jar in one evening. I went to buy some more and there was no more. And I'm like, oh, too bad. And then I started thinking, wow, this product is so good. And in the research that I'm doing, the agricultural sector is one of those few sectors where symmetrical relationships between Arabs and Israelis are possible and where there can be cooperation. So why don't I use this product? And I went to the supermarket and I talked to the general manager and I tried to get the story of how I could order more of the product. And the manager told me the company had gone out of business. And I found out that the guy, Yoel Benish, that was running that, had gone out of business because he was buying his sun-dried tomatoes from Italy and his glass jars from Portugal. And everything was very expensive because he was importing it from Europe. In my research, I knew that he could find great raw materials from the region. So he and I went to his empty factory, as they had already repossessed all of his equipment. And I told him about the idea for Peaceworks, and he loved it, and he really cared about it. Like he and his father had Arab friends, and so the idea resonated in his heart, and we decided to give it a shot. And this time, instead of buying the sun-dried tomatoes from Italy, we bought them from Turkey, and we bought the glass jars from Egypt, and we bought the olives and the olive oil from Palestinian farmers, and that's how Peaceworks started.
The goal of Peaceworks was obviously to get these disparate communities, particularly the Israelis and Palestinians, to cooperate and work together.
It was Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Turks. It was Israel and its neighbors trying to show both sides how they could make money together rather than fight. And it worked at three different levels. The theory of economic cooperation is that if you work with someone across the other side and you start interacting with them and breaking bread together, you end up discovering each other's humanity. It's very hard to hate someone absolutely if you've met them and worked with them.
Yeah.
And then
it's hard to hate up close, as somebody once told me.
Exactly. And then at the business level, you gain vested interest in preserving those relationships because you're profiting from those relationships. So you end up creating economic incentives to maintain and preserve those neighborly relations. And then at the societal level, hopefully you gain a stake in the status quo, and rather than wanting to kill each other, everybody wants to build a better future for their families. That's a theory. It doesn't work perfectly because it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So you also need to have fairness and justice and economic development for everybody, and a political solution that fulfills the aspirations of all peoples to have freedom and dignity and respect. But the economic aspect was very foundational, and the ventures we started in 1993, 1994 stayed solid and steadfast throughout all the vicissitudes of the conflict, even through wars and stuff, up until, after 25 years later, we decided to suspend operations for economic reasons. And then at some point, maybe we'll launch Peaceworks 2.0.
That would be wonderful. It sounds like progress was made, but sadly not enough to resolve the current conflict. Maybe if there were Peaceworks, maybe if there were Peaceworks initiatives or Peaceworks-like initiatives throughout the region, and it could really be scaled, perhaps it would have an even greater impact.
But that's exactly right. We at the micro level, ventures we started were really, really sustainable and scalable, and they had the impact that we anticipated, but it was not enough because they were not of sufficient scale or presence, and there were many other factors which we can discuss that exist both there and here in America that divided people and ended up creating suspicion about the other, which are things we need to overcome.
You got the idea for Kind, your company Kind, when you were building Peaceworks, and you barely had time to eat. You thought, I need something to sustain me. So tell us that story.
Yeah, so I had been running Peaceworks at that point 10 years, from 1993, 94, 2003, 2004. And I had the idea I had a need that I couldn't meet when I was crisscrossing the country, going door by door, selling literally to grocery door to grocery door. Or when I was starting ventures and traveling abroad, I just never found any snack. Or even when I was just working out of my, windowless basement office that was right across from the trash compactor, I couldn't find a snack that I could feel good about eating. It was all either very indulgent or it tasted like cardboard. And long story short, I came up with the idea for using nutrient-dense ingredients like almonds and tree nuts to create a versatile snack that was kind to your body, kind to your taste buds, and kind to the world. And that's how Kind started.
And also, I guess that you could take anywhere that, didn't have many preservatives, if any, and you could put them in your pocket, et cetera, et cetera. But Kind wasn't just the name of the company. It was really emblematic of the values of the company. Tell me
Yeah.
sort of what your goals were in terms of building your business.
So Peaceworks, I was so blessed that I discovered the Peaceworks model of, advancing economic cooperation while and bringing people together while making money. When I had the idea for Kind, I wanted to also find a way to not just make money, but to do something meaningful. The year that I and my team and I conceived Kind is the year my dad passed away. And I think my team helped me. Sasha Hare was at that point our director of marketing, and she and I found the list of all the names we were thinking about. It's crazy how beautiful Kind is and how perfectly it makes sense. But we were like 1 minute apart of having chosen something completely different. Like we had all this iteration. If you see the list of names we were thinking about, it was.
Give me a couple of them.
I was afraid you'd ask. I don't remember them right now, but they literally made no sense, Katie. I'll try to look up that piece of paper and email it to you for you to get a laugh. But it's very funny how, in retrospect, it makes all the sense in the world. But when you're ideating, it's not as obvious. And at that point, my dad had just passed away, and we were looking for an adjective that would fit our three pillars for the product. That was what became kind to your body, nutritionally dense, kind to your taste buds, it has to be delicious, and kind to the world, trying to inspire small acts of kindness and make the world a little kinder every bit at a time. But the catalyst was that was who my father was, right? The kind person that always connected people. And so I think that's what, during that year of mourning my dad, it was a way to honor him and a way to remember all the magic that he brought to my life and other people's lives by trying to name the brand in his honor.
I know that the values are evident in every facet of the company, most notably in the transparent packaging. Why was that such a controversial choice at the time, Daniel?
When we launched Kind, every quote unquote nutrition bar was, even today, by the way, out of the top 10 brands, the other 9, you cannot really look at what the ingredients are. Kind had the idea to respect nature, and rather than use technology to macerate things beyond recognition, was to work really, really hard to perfect the artisanship and craftsmanship of the product. And so it made sense to try to use transparent wrappers for you to be able to see what you were getting. And at the time, it was very controversial because, in our community, people didn't understand where to merchandise us. They would say, this is not a nutritional bar, this is a nutritional bar, and it looked like astronaut food. And I would say, well, that's what the old nutritional bars were. But if you want true nutrition from nature with real food, that ingredients you can see and pronounce as our trademark, then you need to try this out. And not just a transparent wrapper and the whole concept of the category, but even making it was very hard, Katie, because making what our other products are, it's called emulsions or paste. It's very easy to take a bunch of ingredients, turning into a homogeneous mix, and then it runs very easily through the line. But in our case, you couldn't do that because you had to honor the whole tree nuts. And so it was very hard initially, and still takes a lot of work to be able to, at scale, make this type of product. We used to make it by hand initially and cut it by hand. But once we needed to automate more to be able to make millions of bars a day, we needed to come up with the technology and the methodologies to do that. It took a lot of work and a lot of courage to get people to be patient.
But it really worked. I mean, gosh, it's a huge, I guess, $1 billion business now, Daniel. And you sold it, right? You don't, do you
I
tell
didn't
me?
sell, I sold a controlling stake in the company. I still have a meaningful stake in the company, and I'm still deeply involved. And I love working with my team, but I do also now spend, even before, already several years before I did that transaction, I spent about 50% of my time on civic work, on philanthropic work, which I do still today. The other 50%, which is business, it used to be 50% kind. Now it's like 15, 20% kind, and then 30, 35% other business endeavors.
Before we talk about your philanthropy, I just want to backtrack for 1 minute. When Kind started taking off, were you like, holy shit, we'll bleep that out? I can't
Don't
believe
leave
it
that out.
because, I mean, were you just dumbfounded? Or, I mean, as you saw it grow and grow and grow, and then you start creating all sorts of products because you all make granola and you make the bars and you make, gosh, a lot of different things, but all still kind of within this category. Were you just dumbfounded?
My experience as a business person, Katie, is that there's an enormous amount of surprises and enormous amount of stuff that you learn every single day. And entrepreneurs that or founders that position themselves as saviors of humanity are full of shit, because there's an enormous amount of like being lucky to be at the right time. It doesn't mean you don't need to have an extraordinarily hard work ethic. You do, otherwise you're not going to win. And be extremely critical thinker and develop curiosity and compassion and courage in your daily life, and really, really work harder than others and be more creative and be more disruptive. But in addition to that, there needs to be enormous amount of luck and being there at the right time. And I developed the humility because the first 10 years at Peaceworks, I barely survived. It was one step forward, two steps back. My salary right after law school was $24,000, and it was the same for many years, maybe 10 years. And so living in New York City on that salary was not easy. And I had to, buy a shawarma and make it last me 2 meals. And it was very humbling. It was very humbling. I still was having a ton of fun. And back then I thought it was a tremendous success because it really gave me a lot of meaning. But looking back, it was tough. And I didn't even want to tell myself it was tough. But once we launched Kind, you're right, it just took off, and it benefited from all the lessons of all the mistakes that I had done in my first 10 years at Peaceworks. So we were very focused, we were very strategic, as opposed to in Peaceworks where we're trying to be everything to everybody and be in all sorts of shops and do all sorts of products. I had like 7 ventures, one in the Middle East, one in Sri Lanka, one in Indonesia, one in South Africa, one in Mexico. And all these ventures together didn't sell over $2 million. So I had a very long tail of products, and I was enamored with our social mission, but I wasn't focusing enough and being strategic enough. And so I didn't know what I didn't know. Once, after 10 years of lessons, when we launched Kind, we knew to be disciplined. We knew to not, we knew to be focused, and it paid off and it grew a lot. And to your question, I definitely was surprised. I didn't have the vision when I launched Kind that it would become what it became. It's more like you go up a little mountain, and then once you're at that mountain, then you can look higher, and then you scale up the next mountain, and then you can look higher. And my journey as an entrepreneur has always been to dream bigger, but I didn't even have the ability to dream that big. It had to be that once we achieve something, then we realize, oh wow, we can now go further and further and further, and just build ambitious but achievable goals, and then build on top of those.
Sounds like discernment was an important ingredient to your success, to not try to be all things to all people, but really pick a lane, strategize, and really focus on that, which I think is good advice for a lot of entrepreneurs, probably, don't you?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest insights that I got, and I've used this and I've never heard anybody use it anymore, and so people give me credit, but I didn't come up with it. I read it or learned it somewhere. A brand is a promise, and a great brand is a promise well kept. And that for me is the essence of good brand building. If you know who you are and what you are, the brand is to communicate to your consumer exactly what they can expect. It's shorthand for what your values are and what your guardrails are and what you will be and what you won't be. And we entrepreneurs get in trouble when we want to be everything to everyone, and we don't narrow down to just know exactly who we want to be.
Let's talk about your philanthropy now, because I know you have begun to focus your efforts on trying to diminish the divisions we've seen grow and calcify in our country. Why polarization? Why was this area of interest to you?
Well, first of all, Katie, the way my mind works is that I just don't sleep well very, very often. And I try to identify why I don't sleep well. And I just start thinking about it. And I talk a lot to myself. And I try to understand why. What I think as a son of a Holocaust survivor, I have this extra awareness that I cannot just take for granted that I have such a great life and I'm so blessed to have immigrated to America. And for me, the United States is the American experiment is the most beautiful experience. And I'm not saying the United States is perfect, but it's probably the best experiment of any other country out there. But we need to preserve it. And I live in constant worry that my children are going to inherit a much tougher set of circumstances than what my generation inherited. And specifically, I mean, I have five different areas of focus in my philanthropy right now, but the overarching concern that connects to all of those is this growing trend of extremism and dehumanization and tribalism that informs the global conflict across the world. This is rise of authoritarianism that informs anti-Semitism, that informs the conflict that's happening in Israel and the Middle East, that informs what's happening here in the United States. There is and social media makes all of us think we have the answers because we are living in echo chambers, makes us all be a little bit more rigid and a little bit less introspective and a little bit less willing to be curious about understanding the other side. Same with cable news. They're just feeding us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear. And same with politicians who increasingly are just wielding disproportionate power when they take extremist stakes. And we need to change that, because if we don't change that, we cannot assume that our lives, our communities, and our country and our world are going to be what we want for our children. We need to recognize 87%, Katie, of the United States, and I'm sure this is a number that would pair out also globally, are very, very alarmed at the direction of our country towards so much polarization, so much dehumanization, so much hatred, and feel that it has to change. So the overwhelming majority of people feel that, but we're not doing something about it because we all feel powerless. We don't understand what to do. And so Starts With Us is an initiative. I know Peter Coleman is going to join us soon, and he's one of our 213 senior movement partners that have built this movement to try to give people a toolkit of small things they can do in their daily lives to seize back the agenda away from extremism and towards a world that is closer to the America that we inherited than the one where we're approaching. And I can stop there.
Yeah. Because let's bring Peter in, because I know he's waiting. Hi, Peter. Thanks for your patience. Appreciate it. Peter Coleman is a professor of psychology and education at Columbia. Peter has been studying and writing about conflict resolution for his entire career. Peter, thanks for joining us, because I know you're bringing your experience and knowledge to Starts With Us in its effort to bridge the bitter divisions we're seeing in this country. And needless to say, I think many people are very upset about the state of the country. And Peter, why did you want to get involved in this effort?
So I got involved in the study of, I got involved in conflict because I was working with violent urban youth for a period of time. I was working in rehab hospitals and was helping de-escalate situations. I had no idea what I was doing, so I went back to school and studied it and met somebody at Columbia and got very interested in violence prevention and de-escalation and conflict resolution. That was, a long time ago. And I have worked and studied in this area for a long time. One of the things I study is, long-term intractable conflicts that go on for decades. And this particular conflict in the US, political polarization, has its roots in the late 60s, early 70s. So we've been getting progressively worse, escalating, for decades now. So this is in that category of intractability, of seemingly, impossible conflicts to solve or to mitigate. So we've been studying it. I have a lab here called the Difficult Conversations Lab, where we bring people in who are opposed on some moral issue. We study the conditions under which those conversations go well or go poorly. So I've been doing that for a long time. And because of that, when Donald Trump was elected, when political rhetoric was really heating up in the US, I started to get contacted by a lot of organizations. This was before Starts With Us had come together, I believe. And many of these organizations were doing great things, but I felt like they were insufficiently informed by the science. They had, the good hearts, good intentions, and were trying to bring red and blue Americans together in conversation, but oftentimes they weren't doing it in ways that were safe or sufficient, in my view. So I wrote a book called The Way Out, which was my attempt to say, okay, there is science on this. This is what the science is. Pay attention, please. And then I started conversations with Daniel's team and met Daniel soon thereafter. And they're an innovative group of radical provocateurs, I think, who are trying to do disruptive things. And so I love that. I love that they were not trying to do standard things, but they were trying to do innovative, develop innovative interventions. And what I found is that they were listening to the science. When we would have a conversation and they say, we think we want to do this. And I'd say, okay, but understand these may be the consequences. And they'd say, okay, that's good to know. So maybe we need to reshape it, right? So that's been an honor and a pleasure, I think, in working with Daniel's team, is that, I try to bring my understanding of current science around intergroup relations and intergroup conflict and polarization to the conversation. And they in turn, respond to it and adapt and make adjustments. And so I think we're a good team.
So, not to sound like the resident cynic here, but Daniel, this is a pretty tall order. You talked about all the things that are feeding into our divisions. I'm going to ask Peter about the science in a moment because I find that fascinating. But we have obviously become so tribal in all our institutions. For example, you mentioned the media. They seem to have a business model that's predicated on pulling us apart instead of bringing us together. As the country becomes more fragmented and the audience is shrinking, they have to appeal to a rabid fan base, if you will. And the way you do that is the rhetoric is very extreme on both sides. Well, I would say it's more extreme on one side, but we can discuss that. But so how in the world are you going to change it, Daniel?
No, I completely agree that we have our hands full here in terms of the challenge, because it's been a challenge that I've been following for decades, and it's only gotten worse now with the power of social media to atomize echo chambers that tell you what you want to hear. So
and amplify, right?
Amplify, and they're incentivized to scandal. So it's a very serious challenge. For me, my answer is relatively simple. Number one, at the essence, I know the overwhelming, and the data shows it, the overwhelming majority of human beings are wired to want to transcend what is happening to our society today. And so we are the majority, the overwhelming majority, 80, 90% of people are not designed to be nasty jerks. We want to be respectful, but ultimately it comes to our daily habits. Part of the work that Peter does, and the part of the work that starts with us adopting in partnership with him and others, is learning how in your every single day life, in how you interact with one another, will create the set of conditions and culture that your community will live by, and that then the country will live by. Because we are the overwhelming majority of people, and in spite of what you would have people believe, we still share enormous amounts of values. We still share enormous amounts of aspirations for what we want to be, but we need to live by those values with those behaviors. And so a lot of what starts with us is starting with, because then we have even more ambitious goals, but it's starting by injecting into our discourse the 3 C's: curiosity, compassion, and courage, and very concrete things you can do in your daily life to live by those 3 Ds, which is not just going to be about saving America from dictatorship. It's also going to make you a better parent, a more effective business leader, a more effective leader. Like Kind became what it became. It's a $5 billion company today because it really encouraged hearty debate, which is what curiosity is about. Not dehumanizing the other or thinking the other person is wrong, but trying to learn and then get the best ideas to ultimately serve. Because we were compassionate and kind towards one another, because they had the courage to work across lines of difference and to work with each other for a greater good. When you deploy these skill sets in your daily life, you become a better human being, you become a better parent, you become a better business person or doctor or student. They are skills that make all of us fulfill our potential, not to mention they make our nation function. Because when I immigrated from Mexico, I was fascinated to find this country where in 1984, I recall very vividly, people would debate like crazy in the politicians, but then at night they would go to dinner and they were the best of friends. And they learned how to have principled discussions that didn't assume that 50% of the other side of the population are evil. And so I took that for granted, and most Americans take it for granted. But what you need to understand is that democracy and freedom, the oil that keeps that machine well oiled and work functioning, is respect and kindness and the 3 C's. If we don't have that, if we lose that, that's how you see other societies end up getting derailed. So it's very, very important that we rescue it. And the ultimate thing I would answer is, not only is the power of the people, because we're the overwhelming majority, it's that if we don't do it, nobody else will do it for us. So it's imperative that we stand up and do it. The fundamental challenge, though, Katie, is if you're in a tiny minority of extremists that cherish that antagonism, and it's probably less than 10% of the population. But if you're an extremist, you wake up in the morning and you think, how can I advance my cause? If you're a moderate, like the overwhelming majority, you wake up in the morning and are like, what am I going to have for breakfast? And it's in that dichotomy that exists the challenge for us. We need to understand that we cannot just think about what we're going to have for breakfast. All of us, everybody listening to you today, Katie, needs to join Starts With Us, follow it on different channels, or find their own way to start understanding that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. That if you're not applying yourself with the values that you aspire to live by, with respect and kindness and curiosity and compassion and courage, you're creating a vacuum that is going to be filled not just by fringes, but ultimately by all these forces that are incentivized. We're going to ultimately need some regulation because what's happening is not tenable. We're going to ultimately need those institutions to change, but we are the ones that need to change them. Our behaviors ultimately inform the incentives of those actors, because the politicians want to get elected, the cable news want to get higher ratings, social media wants to make more money. We need to make choices that make them understand that, okay, you can give us some of the alarmist stuff, but also give us some of the constructive problem-solving stuff.
Peter, where does science come into all of this? Everywhere. So what I'll say is the good news about the crisis that we're in is that it has created, these kinds of crises, these kinds of times create their own conditions for their own undoing. So the fact that we're, as Daniel was saying, that something like 80 to 90% of Americans are exhausted, fed up, and really looking for, a different way forward. That's good news, right? That means there is a majority that is ripe for something else. This instability that we think we're just coming out of, COVID, awareness of racial injustice, economic downturns, all of this, the Great Resignation, there's been so much tumult in our lives. There's so much anxiety and stress. And that kind of instability, as hard as it is also When we study deeply divided societies that have, at some point in their history, chosen to stop, pivot, and take a different course. Costa Rica is one example. There are many. But in 1948, they came out of a bloody civil war, and they said, okay, this is it. We don't want to ever do this again. Let's choose another path. And that oftentimes comes out of periods of great instability like this. So the good news is we're exhausted, we're miserable, we feel destabilized. And so what we need to provide this middle majority is what the alternative looks like. What do you do? And that's what Daniel's talking about. That's the multiple ideas that are happening. Where I find optimism is that over the past couple of years, I've had the opportunity to work with Starts With Us and other groups that are working in all different sectors. There's a group called Solutions Journalism. Katie, you may be familiar with them, but they've done a project called Complicating the Narrative, where journalists and reporters and publishers are critically looking at how do we cover the news, and how do we contribute to polarization, and are there ways to do this successfully and still bring down the temperature, right? That's happening in politics, it's happening in business, it's happening in journalism. So in major sectors, and then there are 8,000 community-based organizations across the country that are doing this at the community level. So there is a big infrastructure. There's a social movement that's happening. We don't think of it yet. We're not aware of ourselves as a social movement yet, but the infrastructure is there for a social movement. I think that's part of what Starts With Us is trying to do, is say, hey, there's many good people doing good things, bringing us together, which show us how to have respectful conversations, right? We're not trained in this. Americans are trained in debate. I was trained in debate in high school. We see debate in politics. We see debate in law and order. That's what is our default. So a political difference comes up and we move into debate, and it escalates, especially because we oftentimes don't know what we're talking about.
And we also just want to win at all costs. We don't want to listen. We want to prove our point.
And that's basically the design of debate, is to gain to win, right? And that's one way to communicate, but we don't really understand how to listen effectively, how to really listen, to learn about ourselves and others and the issues, right? So there's a lot of work to do to help Americans see what that looks like. But these various bridge building organizations and organizations working in these sectors, they know how to do this. There is science on this. There was Gordon Allport developed something called contact theory in the 1950s. It was about race relations in this country, and it really was about the power of bringing different members of different groups together. And under certain conditions, that can be a transformative thing. But you got to pay attention to those conditions, right? Because otherwise, just bringing people together today can backfire.
Right. And when you mention institutions, Peter, I found it interesting that you didn't mention colleges and universities, which seem to be ground zero right now and have been for a number of years. I did a documentary on this a few years back about sort of the heated debate that's happening at colleges and universities surrounding free speech and also, doing harm to marginalized communities. You saw this unfold recently at Stanford Law School, where there was a federal judge who'd been appointed by Donald Trump, was heckled by students at a talk he gave. And I think the assistant dean, spoke out and talked about harms. And anyway, it was a big mess. So you're at Columbia, what can colleges and universities do to create an environment where civil discourse is actually possible?
Great question. And I have to say, I'm going to call out my own institution. There is an annual report put out called the FIRE report, which is a free speech on college campus report, and they rank colleges and universities from top to bottom. Columbia University for the past 2 years has been the last. Out of 100 points, they get like 8 or 9 points, because the culture here is so progressive and there's been so much cancellation of one another and such a tightness in the culture that students feel like they can't think alternative thoughts, express ambivalence about their political positions. So they really sort of feel trapped. It's not a great learning space, and it is ultimately a high anxiety space, because you can't feel like you can be real and honest with one another. So it's a big problem here. My view is the answer is about socialization. You know, the seniors that are here are the culture. And what you really need to do is really think about new people coming in and how do they come in and what are the kinds of processes you involve them with so that you can open them up to thinking and feeling and talking and behaving differently with people who are different from them. And there are good movements on this. David McCullough has a high school American exchange project, which is a red-blue process. John Haidt's group, the Constructive Dialogue Institute, is working in university spaces. So there are folks working in this sector, and they're really doing this. They're trying to say, okay, when you bring a group of freshmen in, what do you do? How do you start their relationships with others that are different from them? Can you do that more intentionally? I mean, to be honest with you, the same thing happened in Congress over the last 2 years, because there was a group in Congress called the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. Their job was to depolarize Congress and look at the incentive systems. And the first thing they recognize is that when new members of Congress come in, they bring them in, put them on a blue bus and a red bus, have them drive in different directions, and then strategize about, how to dismantle,
how to kill the other side.
How to kill the other side. It's like the first thing they do. And so one of the first recommendations of this committee to Nancy Pelosi at the time was, don't do that.
And also
give them an opportunity to know each other and engage. Yeah.
The political parties are not necessarily our best friends, because their agenda is to win over the other political party rather than to solve problems. So Nancy Pelosi probably didn't accept that proposal because she wants to draw blood. And you see the Republicans and the Democrats constantly, rather than solve problems, see how they can score points against each other. You were saying, Katie, earlier that in your opinion, one side probably is more intolerant than the other. And I suspect that you were thinking that the people that support Trump are much more rigid and inflexible than the people that oppose Trump.
I think I was thinking Fox News versus, say, MSNBC.
Yeah. So
although I do think they both represent two sides, but I feel like Fox News is really the devil, I have to say, Daniel. I think they're awful. I think they're craven. I think they care about ratings and ratings alone, and they'll say anything to get those ratings, even if they don't believe it's true. And that's been shown in the Dominion lawsuit. So they disgust me. Go on.
By the way, will this make it into the podcast?
Probably.
That's good. No,
Great,
I want
yeah.
the candor. Let me tell you, I have equal disgust towards Fox News, particularly for the commentators, because in the news shows it's as less bad than with Tucker Carlson stuff. That stuff is just really an offense against humanity. It's ridiculous. But the problem does exist across the spectrum. We literally just came out with a study where, in partnership with the George Mason University's Center for Media and Public Affairs, they first ranked, because what Peter said is that what Starts With Us does is it works with all the smart people like Peter, but then it tries to help amplify their message and popularize it and make it available to millions and tens of millions rather than to smaller groups. So what we did with CMPA is they were the ones that first identified the 7 most bipartisan members of Congress and the 7 most hyperpartisan members of Congress. And so in the hyperpartisans were the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and,
Lauren Boebert.
Exactly. So extremists, some of them from the left, some of the right, but they were all anti. And the most moderate were Abigail Spanberg, but even people like Don Bacon that you probably have never heard in your life. The most bipartisan out there was Don Bacon, who's a Republican. I forgot what state from. And the most hyperpartisan was Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's also a Republican from Georgia. Marjorie Taylor Greene got more media attention than anybody else. She got more media attention than all the bipartisans together. She got more media attention, 10x more than Don Bacon. 10x. It's not 10% more. It's not 100% more. It's 1,000 times more than Don Bacon. This is the guy that's actually passing legislation. Don Bacon's actually passing legislation, advancing legislation to solve problems, and he's the most bipartisan member. She is just a bomb thrower. She's not passed one single piece of legislation. She's a nothing, but she knows how to say stupid things, right? The stupidity that comes from her mouth. She gets all the attention. You would think that the greatest culprits are the extremist media. You know who was the news source out of the 16 leading stations that gave her the most focus and attention?
What?
The New York Times. And it's not, and then the New York Times, if I speak to my friends at the New York Times, they'll say, well, how can we not cover their stuff? But they didn't cover Rashida Tlaib and the people, the extremists on the left. Those were covered by Fox News. So what ends up happening is news media, with very few exceptions like the Today Show and very few exceptions, news media, they're throwing the red meat to their audiences.
Right, of course.
And it's to your point, it's the incentives for the system.
It's reinforcing preconceived biases. And, what
we need to ask from members of the media is not that they not cover the crazies, because it's impossible for them to not get ratings, but that they just fine-tune those ratios so that instead of 1,000 more coverage, they work a little bit to bring in the constructive people that are actually addressing our problems and trying to advance solutions. And it just to address the ratios a little bit. It's okay if they give a disproportionate amount of attention to some of these people, just not 1,000x, because otherwise, 1,000 times more, because otherwise, when you're one of those freshmen in Congress that are taking the red bus or the blue bus, you're also going to say who's getting the most attention and raising the most money, and you're going to get the wrong message. And we as citizens need to demand, there's a campaign that we just launched, it starts with us, called Change the Coverage. We want everybody to join and say, we want to hear a more balanced set of news where you also tell us about what we can do to make this a better world.
And people who are working on solutions. The worry, I think, is that if it's not incendiary, if it doesn't create a visceral emotional response, people are going to change the channel or not buy the newspaper. This is how we've all been conditioned.
Trained. Exactly.
And we want this, we've been conditioned to be hungry for this red meat that's thrown out at us at so consumers are going to have to also alter their behavior, and they're going to have to eat the dog food that's being served to them, or they'll go back. They'll go back to the much more inflammatory coverage.
It's like picking up our phones, right? We're being trained to all these bad habits, and what Peter's best in class at in the nation, and what starts with us is trying to learn from him, is those little micro habits that can help overcome that. It starts with a little action every day. Peter, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. So what Dan was talking about is that what I realized last summer is I wrote this book and launched it, and we got a beautiful website, and nobody's reading books anymore. So it's not going to move the needle. So a small group of us started to say, okay, so if we were to actually live these actions every day for a little bit of time every day, what would we do? What would that look like? And so we basically sat down, and the book has kind of 5 scientific principles that you can use. We basically generated 100 different micro actions, micro activities, nudges, exercises that you can do. Most of them are every day there's an option that's 5 minutes, and then they can get more. And we piloted it this summer with a small group of people, and I participated myself, and it was helpful. It really helped us sort of start to have different kinds of conversations. The first week, you kind of focus on yourself and your own kind of inclinations and attitudes. The second week, we ask you to start to think about the people you are comfortable talking politics with. Are you being honest? Are you able to, talk about your own ambivalence? And how do you start to, change that conversation maybe? The third week is about trying to find somebody that you're politically alienated from right now. There was a man in my building who I was, friendly with for years.
I
and
read
studied,
that piece in Time magazine. You took a walk with him,
took a
and
walk.
I
Yeah.
mean, he could not have been more different than you in almost every conceivable way. And I
Yeah.
have to say, I don't think I'd want to have dinner with your neighbor, but go on.
But I have to say, again, what it reminded me of what the context of his attitudes were, his opinions,
Right.
and part of it was his religion and part of his upbringing and his grandfather. So, again, being reminded of the humanity of this man helped me hear him, and frankly helped him kind of talk himself away from more extreme opinions.
Right.
So yes, that's one of the actions, one of the activities in this challenge that we offer. So right now starts with us built this website that you can go to and register for this thing. And if you agree to do it, basically it's on you. But every day, there are 4 or 5 things you can choose from, and you can do a small thing. It's like a mindfulness app, right? You can do small things every day.
Let me read some of them, Peter. I'm just going to read them, and you can give us a quick instruction on each one. Number 1, stop to reset. What does that mean?
Well, that means that oftentimes we launch into things automatically. We say things and we get ourselves in trouble, and then we can't walk it back. So if we have any idea, like this walk with my neighbor, I sat down beforehand and said, okay, what do I want to have happen here? Do I want to just escalate it and humiliate him and challenge him? Or do I want to try to better understand? And if so, I got to take this differently. So it is about, when you feel the possibility of things could go awry, go into it with some intentionality and reflection before you start.
Stop. Number 2, spot positive deviance.
Yeah. So the great news is that there are, as I said earlier, thousands of people doing this work. I mean, one of the things I'd ask you to think about is, like, is there somebody in your life who you grew up with or well, who is really good at dealing with hard conflicts, sitting with them, being respectful but firm, right? And who are those? And those are the positive deviants in our life, right? My oldest brother was like that. He'd been a seminarian and a rock star, and it was all these things, he was these contradictions, but he was a beautiful listener. And even when, we would have tensions, or I'd see him have tensions with other people, he always did it with integrity and respect for them. So finding the people and the groups and organizations in your community or your family that can do that and emulating them is where we should start. It's not how to fix problems. It's how do we see people that already manage those effectively, and how can we be more like them?
Complicate to simplify.
Yeah. So again, these days, it's very easy for us to oversimplify them and us and the issues, right? It's like immigration, which is this immensely complex set of issues, becomes about a wall. And that's, ridiculous, right? So in these times, we really have to intentionally complicate our understanding, our experience of things. So one of the things I do is about 2 years ago, I identified 5 people who are on the other side of the political divide from me, who have, opinions and ideas that are opposed to me, but who I think are decent, well-intentioned, and often well-informed. And when the news breaks, instead of just going to my comfort news, I force myself to find them. I go on their Twitter, I go to their networks and see what they have to say, because oftentimes I may disagree, but they're making a point, and that's complicating my understanding of this world, which is so hard to do because of the biases in the news that you were describing.
I just want to say that what Peter does is so commendable, and I try my own version of that. And I don't know if you do, Katie, but it is so extraordinarily exhausting, and yet it's also extraordinarily exhilarating. And what do I mean by that? There are friends of mine that have positions that I find honestly abhorrent. Like I really don't like the way they think. But I keep going back to understand where they're coming from. And honestly, oftentimes I grow from those experiences. And the reason I don't give up, because sometimes they are so full of it. And they're like, how can you take this position? Like, how can you defend Trump on this or that issue? Like, this is despicable. But it's so important to be able to go because A, it's intellectually stimulating if you can set yourself to understand and grow how they see it. B, you are going to be more effective if you develop that skill set to listen and to be able to, like you were talking about the students at Stanford Law School. I'm friends with the dean, who, I don't know if you read Dean Martinez's memorandum and letter, but she had a lot of courage, and she really talked about the importance of being able to create an environment where you can be compassionate, particularly when it's hard to be compassionate, and respectful, particularly when you feel like it's hard. And you're not doing it for their sake, you're doing it for your sake. You're building a better society. If you end up behaving like a jerk, like the way some of these students act, that does not accomplish anything for their side. The student activists that were the leaders of the LGBTQ movement at the SLS were horrified at what happened because they know that set them back. So it made them look not the way they would like to look.
Yeah, the judge was kind of a jerk too to the students. He was,
and they made him look like a hero because of the way they treated him. So that's my point. If you act with so much condescension, I just don't think it's an effective game. It might make you feel good about yourself, but it's actually going to give them the tools for them to say, see, I told you, these guys are crazy, they're radical, we cannot reason with them. And that's sending people towards Trump. We need to have the humanity to respect one another, not just because it's the right thing to do. It's also going to make you much more effective at advancing your cause than if you're looking so intransigent. I think across the spectrum, the speaker, the assistant dean, the students, everybody could have taken some of Peter's guidance, and not only would have left living a better and more fulfilled life, they were actually going to be more likely to advance, to solve problems, rather than to create more polarization. Because the problem with polarization is, and radicalization is, the more that there's an extreme here and you perceive that, the more that you move to the extreme. And it creates a very negative cycle where everybody gets more and more and more radicalized. I saw it happen in the Middle East. I'm seeing it happening in the United States. And the answer of more extremism is not mere extremism on the other side, is more contemplation. And you're going to win. Ultimately, the more high-functioning societies, the more high-functioning families, the more high-functioning companies will be the ones that eschew that approach and learn to be hardy debaters that respect one another, learn to know how to be critical thinkers and critical listeners. Those are skills that are made us the best country that we are, the best companies that get created. We're going to lose that if we lose the ability to have debates with one another in a respectful fashion. So
I try to do that. I mean, I sometimes watch Fox News. Usually I'm disgusted by how smug and smarmy they are, but once in a while I think, that's gives me something to think about. Why wasn't this manifesto by this gunman in Nashville, why shouldn't it be made public? Or is it possible that you can commit a hate crime against Christians? I thought that was very interesting. They're not necessarily a marginalized group, but is that something that we should think about? And it challenged me as I watched it. And I try to be open-minded about all kinds of things, but it's really hard, and it's really hard to talk about it because then you feel like you bring some of these things up that maybe you're kind of going through in your own mind, and then you're afraid because you'll get canceled, or people won't support ambivalence or even open-mindedness in our current culture.
Absolutely. And it's toxic, right? I mean, listening to too much, again, what I'm not recommending when I say reach out to the other side is the crazy nonsense, right? I think the Hannity and Tucker stuff is just, it is pablum, and it is
Put
toxic.
Laura Ingraham in that category too.
I would put her in that category as well, but there definitely are smart conservatives and even smart Trump conservatives that still are reasonable, still are in there trying to make their case, that I can listen to without the craziness. So please, don't misinterpret that I'm saying, yeah, spend the night with Hannity. No, I think that's just toxic. It's finding people that you think are decent, well-intentioned, and informed, and differ from you politically.
But also, we need to evaluate our own side, because the weakness in the work I do is when I tell you 87% of people are fed up with polarization and extremism, everybody nods, everybody feels it. We all understand that there's something wrong with where society is heading, and all the building blocks of partisan hacks and over hyper partisan politicians and cable news and social media algorithms. We all understand it, but most people think the problem's on the other side. So I have a dear friend that I think is one of the smartest people I know from the right. And he nods when I say this, but he thinks all the problem is in the wokeism on the left. And then I have very dear friends that are progressives, and they nod, but they think the problem's on the right. The truth is, all of us suffer from this, every single one of us, because we're all being part of these, institutions and mechanisms that are manipulating us for profit and for power. And so we need to break those shackles and use the skill sets to think critically. If we're always listening to our own news, be more critical about our own news sources. Open your mind to listen to the other side, and try to understand the holes in your own thinking. And it's only going to make you stronger and awaken the righteousness of your thing if you really develop the skill set to understand with nuance all those things. And it's more likely to lead to constructive solutions. But the biggest problem, by the way, is that there is this semblance of antagonism and division that is actually not true when you look at the data. There's one of our partners is called Beyond Conflict. They did this beautiful work where if I ask you, Katie, where do people stand on immigration? You'll assume that there's an extreme left position here, an extreme right position here. That's a perception. The reality is that on 80% of the issues, 80% of the people agree on immigration, but not just on immigration, on abortion versus choice, on education in our schools, on how to create policies about, some of these hot potato issues that people don't even want to mention the word to not because about how do we respect transgender people while also respecting people that have that want to participate in sports. 80% of Americans, probably 90%, can agree on 90% of the issues. But politicians are trying to use these communities as their kicking balls and as wedge issues, and it's just unfair to everybody. And
I know. Well, think about it. I think everyone would like to see comprehensive immigration reform, some kind of fair system. And yet it behooves these politicians to weaponize immigration instead of solve the problem. So part of it, you talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she throws these, flaming swords out into the public. She gets more attention. That translates to more money. So she's incentivized to weaponize and use these as wedge issues, as you said, Daniel, instead of going to the other side and saying, how can we come up with a system that's fair to everyone, and that, that the United States can accommodate, the number of immigrants who are coming in, and how can we work to determine who is a true, economic refugee or political, who's really seeking political assignment. How can we modernize our immigration system? But there's no incentive to do that.
We're developing a methodology that starts with us that is going to be launched in the coming months to precisely tackle that. It's probably too much for today's podcast.
Yeah.
But at some point I will share that with you, and you'll be very energized, because we're actually going to empower citizens with the power for them to focus on constructive solutions that they will then mandate from the political representatives to follow the will of the people rather than get hijacked by extremism. So I would hope that all of your listeners will join us and start following Starts With Us, because very soon we're going to give them the tools for them to actually demand accountability and achieve accountability from the political representatives.
Well, I think this is such an interesting conversation. Peter, at some point, I'd like to go through the history since the 50s and understand, how we got to this point from the 50s on. I know you call it American psychosis. I wish we had time to talk more about that. We'll have to do it during another podcast. Otherwise, this is going to be so long. People will have stopped listening many minutes ago. But Daniel and Peter, thank you both so much for talking with us. This is a fascinating and conversation and such an important issue because democracies aren't guaranteed, are they? And we want to preserve ours as long as we possibly can. And we're not going to be able to do that unless we come together and solve some of these intractable problems.